I'm James McElvenney, and you're listening to the History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences podcast, online at hifilangsi.net. There you can find links and references to all the literature we discuss. We're still in Leipzig. We're doing a few Leipzig-themed episodes. Today we're with Gereon Müller in his office in Leipzig to talk about his book, Lanes to Language. So, to get us started, could you briefly describe your book, Lanes to Language, which perhaps defies a simple classification in terms of genre and content?
Yes. The book Lanes to Language is quite an unusual book, I think, in the sense that it's a linguistic bike tour guide for Leipzig and its surroundings. So the idea is to introduce the life and work of the 20 scholars who are addressed in 20 bike tours. And these scholars turn out to have been very important for the development of modern language science. So the book basically combines linguistics, cycling, and Leipzig.
Okay. So Leipzig was an important place in the history of linguistics then?
Yes, I think it's fairly uncontroversial that Leipzig was the main place for doing linguistics from the 1870s until maybe the 1920s or so. And not only in Europe, but really worldwide. And this is something that, of course, we linguists at the University of Leipzig are extremely proud of.
Yeah, so I guess you probably couldn't write that book about anywhere else in the world, could you?
You know, I don't know. As it happens, so the original inspiration I got for this book was from tours, guided tours, that Guido Mensching and Lina Elhaj-Mensching did in Göttingen, which is another place which has lots of important linguistics since roughly the same time. And they did a tour, guided tour through central parts of Göttingen, where they showed us places where famous linguists lived and worked. And I got that as an inspiration, and then went on to do the same thing for Leipzig at the beginning of the pandemic. And the original idea was basically to make the introduction to linguistics a bit more interesting to the students when we had to do virtual teaching, and also make the course a bit more interesting to myself, I guess. So that's where the tradition comes from. And I think, so to answer your question properly, I think there are other places in Germany where one could do such a project in the history of linguistics, Göttingen being maybe the most obvious one. And interestingly, in Leipzig, as opposed to Göttingen, for instance, there are no commemorative plaques whatsoever remembering any of the places where these famous linguists lived or worked. Okay. And they are famous, and there are lots of them. Yeah. But one could do this for other places. One could do this for places in the US, I guess.
But you'd need bike lanes, wouldn't you?
No, actually, so the title lane doesn't come from bike lane. So it comes from the British concept of a lane as a small road with very, very little traffic on it. So there's this series of excellent bike tour guides for different areas of Great Britain, written by Jack Thurston, which are called Lost Lanes, North, Wales, South, and so on and so forth. And I think I got the inspiration for the title there. So it's not about bike lanes, it's about small roads with very little traffic. Yeah. And of course, bike paths and everything that you want to use as a cyclist for these kinds of tours.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you pick the 20 figures that feature in your book?
I think by and large they picked themselves for obvious reasons. So you have had people who basically initiated the notion or initiated the idea that there is a single notion of a grammatical rule which is inviolable to begin with, and these were the neo-grammarians, and at the heart of the neo-grammarian movement were Karl Brugmann and August Leskien. And those two people basically started all of this in the 1870s or so, and they were here as professors until the 1910s, or even, basically 1910s. And they started all this, and then all the other people then came here because Leipzig very quickly became the center for doing linguistics. And so Ferdinand de Saussure came here, finished his dissertation, and then went back to Geneva and became world famous and founded structuralism. Same for Jan-Nieczesław Baudouin de Courtenay. He came here, was actually the first one to finish his dissertation with Auguste Leskine, and he also developed a very closely related concept of structuralism to the Saussurean one, and went on to Dorpat and Kazan, and came up with the phoneme afterwards. And so all these people very obviously qualified as protagonists of these bike tours. And Karl Werner didn't come to, so Karl Werner, the one who discovered Werner's law, didn't come to Leipzig as such. He went to Halle, but the basic idea that people had was to get him to this area so he could participate in the meetings, the regular meetings that the new grammarians had at that point.
And Halle is about 20 minutes on the train now.
Yeah, and I think it must not have been much longer, and the train was in place, the train connection was in place at that point already. Werner regularly visited.
And how long is it on your bike?
Actually, there are 2 bike tours going to Halle, and they are roughly 80 kilometers or something like that. But if one finds that a bit too long, one can always just take the tour to Halle and then take the S-Bahn back. No problem there. And it's like that with most of the tours. So the tours are roughly between 35 and, in one case, 120 kilometers long, and they are doable for many cyclists, but you can always cut them short by taking the train at some point.
Yeah, okay. So once you had picked these 20 figures, what was your approach to researching them? Did you rely mainly on secondary materials in the history of linguistics, or did you go out into the archives and visit the places that they lived, of course? Both, actually, both. So I read a lot and I learned a lot by reading literature on these people from descriptions in the history of linguistic science. And I also went to the archives. I read lots and lots of letters, and I visited the virtual archives that you can access on the internet, but also like Calliope, but I also went to various different archives, the University of Leipzig archive, for instance, and the archive of the city of Leipzig, and the special collections archive of the university library. So 3 different archives where I spent too much time, to be honest. Yeah, so I tried to do all of this in my spare time, and it was quite a bit of work, but it was fun. It was fun reading all these old letters that people wrote to each other, reading all the documents archived by the university. In some cases, finding out information, for instance, about the places where people lived and worked, and maybe did other things like being incarcerated. In 2 cases, that was pretty straightforward. In other cases, it turned out to be quite hard to find the place where people who came here for maybe somewhat shorter stays lived. So the hardest case, if you're interested in that, was Fürst Trubetskoy, Nikolai Trubetskoy, the basically founder of modern phonology, I would say. And that turned out to be really, really hard. And I visited a lot of different sites on the internet, Russian sites and English language sites, and it was really hard. And in the end, I found the place where he stayed when he was here for 1 semester in winter term 1913, together with Leonard Bloomfield and Lucien Tenier. And I found the place, and as it turns out, the place now hosts a bike shop. Okay.
And it's like 50 meters from the place where we sit at this point from the Department of Linguistics.
Okay, wow. And what kind of place is it? Like, was he a person of means and had a very nice accommodations here? Or?
Very much so, yeah, very much so, of course. Like most of these people were reasonably rich, I would say, yeah. And so definitely this holds for Fürst Trubetskoy. And he stayed with a landlady that took care of everything and that rented out rooms to affluent students from other areas, among them Trubetskoy.
Yeah, okay. And when you say two of your figures were incarcerated, do you mean like as students? So
they spent time in prison. So there's one chapter in the book on Manfred Bierwisch. Bierwisch is without any doubt the most important German-speaking linguist of the previous century, I would say. And he got his PhD from Leipzig University with a dissertation on German verbs, basically founding German syntax in the Chomskyan sense. Bierwisch was born in Halle but grew up in Leipzig, and as a student was sent to prison for many months, like 10 or so months that he actually spent in Leipzig prisons because of political reasons. He brought magazines from West Berlin into the GDR, and that was not allowed. So he was one, and Lucien Tenière, the founder of dependency grammar, who spent time in Leipzig with Leonard Bloomfield and Nikolai Trubetskoy, studying with Wilhelm Wundt, August Leskin, Karl Bruckmann, all these people. Lucien Tenière went back after the winter term 1913-1914, went back to France, and then World War I started, and he became a soldier, fought in the war for a while, and then very quickly became a prisoner of war. And he was confined to the prisoner of war camp in Merseburg, which is like 35 kilometers west of Leipzig, and this is the other case where people were actually incarcerated in some sense.
Yeah, okay, yeah. When you first said that, I was picturing, like the Burschenschaften.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Which is sort of like the, 19th century and early 20th century equivalent of frat houses, I guess, in the American context. Okay, yeah. So I guess, you're covering figures over a very long period from sort of the 1870s up into maybe the 1970s. Is that the end, or...?
Well, the end is actually two important GDR professors. The very final two chapters are on Gerhard Helbig, who was a professor in the Herder Institute, doing German as a second language research. But more generally, he was really an excellent grammarian, and he, together with Buscha, wrote what I still regard as the best German grammar, Deutsche Grammatik für den Ausländerunterricht. And Anita Stoiber, who basically refounded the linguistics department that we are in now at the moment, after a reunification at some point. She also was active. So Helbig was active until, 2010 or so, and Anita Stoiber was, even though she was retired, she was my direct predecessor, she was retired. At that point she was active until very shortly before her death a few years ago. Yeah, so that basically, it stops in very recent periods. Yeah,
but I guess in that period that's sort of over 100 years, Leipzig has gone through many changes, like, from the 1870s as, sort of the beginning of the German Empire. Then you've got World War I, the Weimar period, the Nazi period, and then the DDR, the East German period, and then reunification. So it's Leipzig, the face of Leipzig, and life in Leipzig has been radically different in all of those periods.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. And as a consequence of World War II in particular, some of the places, some of the buildings in which people live do not exist anymore in that form in that they existed before. Yeah, that's a bit unfortunate, but I'm afraid nothing can be done about that.
But looking at the way that your figures lived in Leipzig in these different periods, do you sort of see reflected anything about the character of science? Like how the sort of social conditions and political conditions might have influenced the way they thought about their scientific object of study and their approach?
I'm not sure about that, actually. One thing that is very clear is that the earlier protagonists of this book were like Karl Bruckmann and Leskine, who started everything, and then the ones that came directly afterwards were very much affluent people and lived in fancy flats and in various places. And when you look at people from the GDR period, you see that sometimes they lived in places which do not look so great. But I'm not sure that this directly influenced their approaches to linguistics. I mean, among the scholars that figure prominently in the book, you have people coming from the aristocracy, like 4 of them at least. Saussure and Trubetskoy and von der Gabelens and also Baudouin de Courtenay. And you have other people who maybe were not rich to begin with, but then became rich. Maybe, for instance, Leskine left the middle class from which he originated in Kiel and became a member of the upper class basically by marrying a woman from the Brockhaus publishing company, for instance. This is one end of the scale. On the other end, you have people from the GDR periods. And as we all know, the GDR made an explicit effort to support people from the lower classes in their studies. So some of the people towards the end of the book's final chapters actually are working class, have a working class background. This holds for Helbig, this holds for Stoiber and also for Ruzicka, for instance. Interestingly, Manfred Bierwisch didn't have a working class background, which means that he had severe problems to be admitted to Leipzig University in the first place when he wanted to start his studies in the 1950s.
Did he do a year in the production or something like that?
No, he for some reason place was available. He wanted to study German philology, and there was no place available for him initially. And so what he did is he started doing physics and work as freelancer at the radio, MDR, or whatever the predecessor was called at that point.
Was it Rundfunk, the DDR?
Yeah, but he then was admitted after 1 year as a student. Yeah. So anyway, what I really wanted to say is that you have vastly diverging sociological backgrounds. The scholars that figure in the book belong to very different classes. That said, the kinds of linguistics that they did is surprisingly similar. And I think, so maybe this is an oversimplification, and people like you who've done work on the history of the language sciences have a much more fine-grained approach. But for me, I take it to be kind of legitimate to say that there's a very simple common thread going through all the different kinds of approaches. So all the scholars that show up in the book are primarily interested in the question, how does language work? Okay, and then to simplify this extremely, the neo-grammarians established the idea that you have proper inviolable rules coming from the natural sciences as part of grammar, and grammar is the core of every existing language. And then the structuralists like Baudouin de Courtenay and Saussure and Trubetskoy and all the others established the idea that these rules are part of consistent systems. And then the Chomskyan revolution just added added the cognitive perspective, right? You have a faculty of language as a sort of universal grammar encoded in your brain, and then given primary data, you develop a grammar, which is a system consisting of these rules. So this is a very simple-minded, but I think essentially correct and way of characterizing the major development of linguistics over the last 150 years or so. And it can all be verified based on the individual scholars who worked here at Leipzig University, which I find immensely impressive.
Okay. But do you think there's continuity in that? Like, do you think there's a tradition?
I do. I know that lots of people think differently, but that's the impression that I also got from looking at the primary literature, looking at what these people have actually done, what Brugmann, what Leskine have proposed, what Saussure has proposed when he did actual analysis. So I actually tried to integrate into each chapter information about hands-on actual linguistic analyses, precise information about linguistic analyses that these scholars came up with. And I think one can say that there's really absolute continuity and progress at the same time, but it's not a radically different kind of linguistics. So when Saussure, for instance, Saussure is well known for many things that you find in linguistics overviews and textbooks, but Saussure also, for instance, came up with a very precise and modern account of stress placement in Lithuanian. So he left for Lithuania after he finished his dissertation in Leipzig, and he has a very modern analysis subsumed under the labels Saussure's law on accent placement in Lithuanian, which depends on mora as a concept of syllable weight, which is very modern and has been reinterpreted in optimality theoretic terms, like many of these other laws. There's also Brugmann's law and Siever's law and Osthoff's law, Osthoff being another one that I haven't mentioned yet, of the people from the Leipzig University linguistics scene at that point. So there's really, these analyses are very modern, very clear, and have directly had an influence on current linguistic theorizing. Yeah. And so just give you one or two other cases maybe. Von der Gabelens, the one that you basically have done a lot of work on, introduced what we now know as topic, comment, information structural notions when he talked about psychological subjects and psychological predicates instead of just grammatical and predicates. And von der Gabelens talked about explicitness versus economy in linguistic analysis, which is absolutely modern as a concept and something that, for instance, frameworks like the minimalist program and optimality theory mention.
So do you think these figures are mainly interesting as our predecessors, like for how they prefigure what we do now? Or do you think that there might also be interest in maybe some of the wrong, in inverted commas, paths that they went down?
I don't really know to what extent they went down wrong paths. So do you have a suggestion for a case where people actually...
Well, I mean, on the example of Gabelens, he introduced the term typology in a specifically linguistic sense and continued that sort of Humboldtian tradition of typology, long after it was no longer cool in the 19th century, like it was considered sort of out of date. But it could be seen as his sort of notions of the structures of languages and how they hang together could be seen as prefiguring key ideas about how we understand typology now, and even key ideas in structuralism.
Yes.
However, the whole point of Gabelens's project was to link linguistic structures to different kinds of societies and mentalities. Yeah. And this is something that, I mean, there is work now in areas like linguistic complexity that sort of revives some of these ideas very carefully without trying to be overtly judgmental and have scales of civilization. Yeah. But the whole motivation for Gabelens's project is really strange to us and would be considered not cool, not politically correct.
The other case, which is very similar to what you've just described, is Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt was a famous psychologist who founded experimental psychology as we know it nowadays, and therefore also experimental linguistics as we know it nowadays. But he held these very weird views on language and race and culture, which are really at some point, well, they are fortunately not generally agreed on anymore, to put it like that. But still, even Wundt came up with very important concepts for modern linguistics. So just give you to give you two examples. Wundt would seem to be the one who first introduced the feature participant covering first and second as opposed to third person into modern linguistics, and he's regularly cited for that in the modern morphological literature. And Wundt also, when discussing free word order languages, came up with the idea that you put the most salient stuff first, the topic stuff first, and then move on linearly to more newer material in the sentence. So even Wundt, who has these weird views that people don't hold anymore, and talks a lot about them in his 2-volume, 1,300-page book called Die Sprache, or Sprache. Even Wundt has very important contributions to modern linguistics, and this holds for virtually all the 20 protagonists in the book.
But I mean, I would argue that is actually like the strangeness. I mean, this is something I've said before, but I would argue that the strangeness of a lot of these figures that we hold up as our predecessors is actually one of the most interesting things, and perhaps even one of the most valuable things in studying the history of our field, that we see that the ideas that we use now and the methods we use now have very strange origins, or that is to say, they have origins that are very different from a lot of the assumptions that we would just hold as being basic truths now. And this is also valuable for relativizing what we do now, I think, because when we see how strange our predecessors look, we might think to ourselves, well, maybe these things that we think are just obvious truths are not quite so simple.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent I think I agree, to some extent I don't. So much of what I can read in these earlier linguists' work doesn't look strange to me at all. So I find the analysis, as I try to say, some of the analysis are extremely modern, and I don't find them strange at all. Bloomfield has, for instance, who also, as I said, spent a semester in Leipzig in 1913, has a super interesting, extremely modern analysis of the interaction in Tagalog of reduplication with coalescence. And that, if you read it, anticipates a lot of discussions in later cyclic phonology and also in optimality theory, because it basically explicitly invokes counterbleeding in the Kiparsky-Chomskyan sense, and it also has discussion of the strict cycle condition, which seems to be violated by his analysis. And then he basically says in modern terms, this is my account of the interaction of coalescence and reduplication in Tagalog, but unfortunately it seems to violate strict cyclicity, because you have to do something in an embedded domain once you've finished the larger domain, which is unusual. So many cases where I really think these analyses that these people came up with, upon closer inspection, are really modern, and there is continuity and there is progress, both. But there's not really a completely different perspective on things. I think all these people were interested in the question, how does language work? And they tried to answer it as best they could. Yeah. And in some cases, it's still very good, the answers that they come up with, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's but I mean, I take your point that lots of things that people said is also not something that we would accept nowadays. Yes. And it's important that people like you actually work on these aspects too. But
I mean, that's a respectable position to say that there is, science and that we can make progress. And I mean, it's definitely an optimistic position. Although I wouldn't have expected a German professor to be taking the optimistic position, and an Australian postdoc to be advocating the pessimistic position, but there you go. Yeah.
I don't know.
So, I mean, Lanes to Language is a very playful book, combining bike riding and sort of personal history and the history of the city with the details of progress in linguistic analysis. But do you think that it's important reading for scholars in the field and for students? I mean, I would say it is, but would you?
I'm not so sure. So scholars, there are a few. I mean, there are a few things which are really new, like many of the places that I found where linguistic scholars from Leipzig University worked and lived are really new. You cannot find them anywhere. If you want to find them, this is where you have to look. In some cases, I think was able to show that some specific analyses, linguistic specific analyses that these scholars had come up with are really super important for current linguistics, and maybe this cannot be found so obviously in other kinds of books. That said, okay, so and the third thing is really, I also was very careful to design interesting bike tours. So the riding should be fun. Riding your bike and visiting these places where linguists lived and worked should be fun, and I hope I succeeded in that. So for these reasons, this is innovative. Other aspects I'm not so sure about. So is this should this be compulsory reading for either linguists or history of linguistics scholars? No, I don't think so. I don't think it's necessary. It might be helpful for people who want to have some background information. It might be helpful for students who want to learn about where the ideas that they are subjected to in the various courses, the BA and MA programs that we have, come from. But important reading. Reading the book should be fun. Whether you actually try out the tours or just do armchair cycling, so to speak, and just cycle these tours in your head, then it should be fun. It shouldn't. It's not strictly necessary.
And you can actually download the tours, like the
of course. You can download all the tours from the. When doing the research for the book, I repeatedly asked myself the question: why did Leipzig, of all places, become such an important place for linguistics, and why were so many ideas first developed here? Why did all the people come here? What exactly was it that brought that about? That's the question that I asked myself, and I think the answer is that it really boils down to the activities of these two people. It's just two people. It's Karl Bruckmann and August Leskin, and they happened to be extremely good linguists, and they happened to be interested in their students, and they happened to be able to basically organize things and create a center. And then more and more people came, and then everything went smoothly. And they were here for I don't know, 4 decades or 5 decades. And then at some point also Sievers entered the picture, and then these people worked together and helped each other, and they were all good linguists, and they were all willing to work together to cooperate. And this basically created the place, and that's something I basically learned. One has to cooperate. One has to have a small number of good people, excellent scientists who are willing to cooperate in order to create something like they created, which lasted for, I don't know, half a century at least, and then also was eventually responsible for the fact that after the Second World War, linguistics again became a very important topic at Leipzig University, with people like Rudolf Ruzicka and Manfred Bierwisch, who on a smaller scale did something very similar to what Bruckmann and Leskin had done in the 1870s.
Yeah.
So this is something that I took away from that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the interview. Yeah.